Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I remember the first letter vividly. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, like any other piece of mail. It was a thick envelope, slightly crumpled from the journey. There was no return address. Just my name, scrawled hastily in black ink with words for you written beneath it. I wasn't expecting anything, not even a bill. Yet, I felt an odd, uneasy sensation as I stared at it in my hands. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just some junk mail. But something inside me told me this was different. I opened the envelope carefully, my fingers trembling, though I didn't know why. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Blank. Nothing written on it. No message. Just an empty space where words should have been. I stared at the paper for a long time, waiting for something to appear. A second, a minute, maybe longer. But nothing. Just as I was about to discard it, I noticed something small, almost imperceptible, at the very corner of the page. A single word, written in faint, smudged ink, wait. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't make sense. Why would someone send me a letter like this? And why was the word so unsettling? I spent the next few hours trying to shake off the feeling, blaming the weirdness on my overactive imagination. But it lingered. That word. It haunted me, creeping into my thoughts like an unwelcome shadow. The next morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. This one was different. The envelope was larger, more carefully sealed. I almost didn't want to open it. The memory of the first one had stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. But I did. Inside was another sheet of paper. This time, it wasn't blank. It contained only one word, soon. My breath caught in my throat. The word sent chills down my spine, as though it was some sort of warning. What did it mean? Why was I getting these cryptic letters? And why did each word feel like a weight, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just some prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though something was slowly tightening around me, a presence I couldn't quite understand. The sound of my phone buzzing on the table made me jump. I picked it up, hoping for a distraction, and glanced at the screen. It was a message from my sister, Claire. Are you okay? You seem off lately. I typed back, telling her everything was fine, but deep down, I wasn't sure. Something was happening, something I didn't understand, and it was making my world feel wrong. That night, I heard a sound. A faint scratching, almost like someone dragging something across the floor. I was sure I was alone in the apartment. It came from the direction of the hallway. The same place I had been earlier, pacing nervously after receiving the letters. I stood still for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. It had to be the wind, right? There was no reason for me to be afraid. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the scratching sound grew louder, closer, and then, just as quickly, it stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I stood there, frozen, staring down the hallway. My eyes darted over the familiar, everyday objects. The coat rack, the lamp, the shoes scattered on the floor. Everything was where it should be. But something felt off. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was watching me, waiting. And that the letters had only been the beginning. Suddenly, I heard it again. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Wait. I didn't know who or what was saying it, but I knew then that nothing would be the same. The silence in my apartment pressed down on me, suffocating. I wasn't sure whether to run or stay, to scream or to be still. The whispering, that faint word, wait, echoed in my mind, replaying over and over, as though it were something I should have known all along. I had no idea why, but it seemed familiar. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring down the hallway, my pulse racing. The scratching sound stopped, but the weight of the air didn't lift. My eyes flicked nervously from one corner of the room to another, my body tense, waiting for something to happen. My mind screamed at me to call someone, to make sure I wasn't losing it. But no one would believe me. I took a hesitant step forward, toward the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My apartment had always been a haven for me, a place of comfort and familiarity. Yet, now it felt as if something inside it was slowly unraveling, like I was no longer in control of my own space. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. I took another step, then another. My feet dragged across the floor, reluctant, as if the apartment itself was trying to hold me back. I reached the living room and glanced at the door, the front door that I was sure I had locked. It was ajar, just slightly. My heart thudded in my chest. Had I left it open? I couldn't remember. I moved forward slowly, a strange sense of dread filling me. The door creaked open just a little further as I approached. My fingers twitched at my side, and I reached for the doorknob, hesitating just a moment longer. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something, a faint, strange scent in the air. It was hard to place, but it made my stomach twist. It was almost like metal? No, something sharper, colder. The smell of something wrong. I walked through the dim hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the walls. My breathing quickened. I reached the kitchen. And then I saw it. Another letter. The same heavy, crumpled envelope, just like the last one. It was on the kitchen table, right where I had left the empty one from the day before. The same message, no return address, no sign of who might have sent it. My hands trembled as I picked it up, fear gnawing at me from the inside. I almost didn't want to open it, but I couldn't help myself. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. This time, the word wasn't faint or smudged. It was clear, written with a deliberate, careful hand. It read, "Tonight." I felt my stomach drop. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room. The word had weight, it had presence. I couldn't stop myself from thinking of all the implications. Why was it always just one word? Why that word? And more importantly, who was sending these? I stumbled back a few steps, pressing my back against the cold kitchen counter, staring at the paper in my hands. The chill from the counter seeped into my spine, but it didn't make me feel any more grounded. It only made the room feel colder, the shadows deeper. I could barely breathe. The whispering came again, like a distant murmur, but this time it was clearer. Tonight. Wait. I looked around the kitchen, trying to shake off the sense that the walls were closing in. What was it telling me to wait for? I could barely think, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of it all. Each letter, each word felt like it was luring me closer to something I couldn't yet see, something I wasn't ready for. The apartment felt empty. I'd never noticed how quiet it could be before. No hum of the fridge, no ticking of the clock. Just a cold silence pressing in, like I was waiting for something that would never come. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a sound that broke the stillness. I grabbed it desperately, hoping for some kind of relief. It was Claire again. "You're scaring me. I'm coming over. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the screen. I could tell her everything. I could tell her about the letters, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. But I knew she wouldn't believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. I didn't want to be alone. But at the same time, I didn't want to put anyone else in danger. Then, I heard it. A knock. Soft at first. Then louder, more insistent. It came from the front door. I froze. It wasn't Claire. I hadn't heard anyone approach. No footsteps, no car in the driveway. It was like whoever was out there had appeared out of nowhere. I stood motionless for a moment, the knock growing louder with each passing second. It was as though the door was vibrating under the pressure of the knocks. Each one felt like a hammer, pounding through my chest. My heart raced, and the walls seemed to close in even tighter. "Wait," the whisper urged again. It wasn't my sister. It couldn't be. Something told me I wasn't supposed to open the door. Something deep inside me screamed that I should run, hide, get away. But my legs wouldn't move. My mind was clouded with confusion and terror. Another knock. Louder. Wait. Then, silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What did it mean? Who was on the other side? I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I would find. The knock came again. Louder. More urgent. My breath hitched in my throat as I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt thick, like I was drowning in it. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to do something, anything. But my body refused to obey. The silence between knocks felt endless, stretching out like a deep, yawning chasm. I stared at the door, my hands trembling, the paper from the latest letter still clutched in my fingers. The word "tonight" echoed in my mind, growing louder, as though the walls themselves were repeating it. I should open it. Shouldn't I? No, I thought, as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. It's not safe. But what was I supposed to do? I couldn't just ignore it. The letters, the whispers, the strange, creeping fear that had settled into every corner of my apartment, it was all leading to this moment. The knock. The presence outside. The thing I hadn't wanted to face. Another knock. A single, sharp rap that seemed to pierce through the tension, shattering my thoughts. I was about to move, to flee, to do something, anything, when my phone buzzed again. It startled me, and I almost dropped it. It was Claire, her name flashing on the screen in bold, frantic letters. "Where are you?" "I'm outside. Please open the door." I glanced at the door, heart racing. Was it Claire? Was it really her? Or was something else behind that knock? My mind raced, torn between the possibility that Claire had come to help me and the gut-wrenching fear that opening the door would only make things worse. I stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, debating. The knock came once more, faster, relentless, as though the person on the other side knew I was hesitating. "Wait," the whisper said again, barely audible but unmistakable. I felt a surge of panic, like something inside me was pushing me to do the opposite of what I wanted. I knew this wasn't a game. It wasn't a prank. It was real. Too real. The weight of it pressed down on me, like a vice around my chest. I backed away from the door, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind scrambled for a plan. Maybe I could run. Maybe I could leave the apartment. But then I thought of the letters. Of the word tonight. Whatever was happening, it felt like there was no escape. A sudden flash of memory hit me. The first letter. The word wait. Had it meant something deeper? Had it been warning me to stay inside? Before I could process the thought, the knocking stopped. I listened, straining my ears to catch any sound. The silence was deafening, thick with expectation. I couldn't tell if I felt relieved or more terrified. And then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like something moving along the floor just outside my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze again. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. Something was there. I stepped back into the living room, trying to steady my breathing. The floor beneath my feet felt cold, too cold. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, stretching out longer than they should have. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. Another noise, faint but unmistakable, a whisper, so close it sent a shiver up my spine. I leaned in closer to hear it, but it was so faint it was almost impossible to tell if it was real. "Open the door." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't Claire's. It wasn't anyone I knew. I glanced at the clock. The time was drawing closer to midnight, the hour that had been hanging over me ever since the first letter. Was that the significance of the word tonight? Was this the moment it had been leading up to? I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my feet wouldn't move. My hands were glued to my sides, as though I were rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The apartment seemed to shift around me. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were shapes, figures moving in the corners of my vision. They didn't make sense. They weren't human. I turned, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone in the room. There, in the reflection of the dark window, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure, tall, indistinct, draped in darkness, loomed in the reflection behind me, just out of reach. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I rushed to the door, trembling. My hand was inches away from the doorknob when a sharp crack of sound rang through the apartment, like something had fallen. Something heavy. I spun around again. The room was now even darker than before. The shadows had stretched to the edges of the walls, closing in, pressing in on me like they were alive. The knocking began again, this time faster. More frantic. It echoed through the hall, reverberating in my ears. "Open it." The voice came again, clearer, louder, from right outside the door. I wanted to scream. To do something, anything, but I felt paralyzed, trapped by fear. There was no escape. I knew it now. Whatever this was, it was coming for me. The knocking didn't stop. In fact, it only grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side of the door had lost all patience. Each knock felt like a hammer, slamming into the fragile wall of my sanity, driving deeper into my skull. The rhythm became erratic, almost frantic, like the pulse of a heart beating too fast. I stood there, paralyzed, my eyes glued to the door. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to flee, to run, to escape the madness that was clawing at my mind. But my legs refused to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. The handle, it was turning. Slowly, but unmistakably. I backed away, my breath shallow, my chest tight. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the space shrinking with every passing second. My phone buzzed again, Claire's name flashing on the screen once more. Open the door, please. I know something's wrong. I should have opened it. I should have let her in. I knew she was trying to help, that she was outside, just on the other side. But something deep inside me, something primal, told me that if I opened that door, everything would change. I could feel it. Something wasn't right. The handle twisted again, this time with a force that made the wood creak under the pressure. I could hear it. I could hear the breath, slow, deliberate, on the other side. Was it Claire? No. It wasn't her. It wasn't anyone I knew. I could feel the presence. It was wrong. The door shook again. The wood groaned like it was about to give way. I had no choice now. I had to open it. But what if I didn't? What if it was already too late? I moved toward the door, the cold air biting at my skin. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the knob. My thoughts spun in circles. My head felt heavy. But I had to do this. I had to know what was on the other side. I twisted the knob, and the door creaked open. A sliver. Just enough to see outside. The hallway was dark. The only light came from the flickering bulb above, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. It was the figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, too tall. Its form was almost too blurry, as if it didn't belong in this world. Its features were indistinct, a shifting blur of darkness and shape. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But I knew it was watching me. A cold chill wrapped around my spine. The air was thick, suffocating, like I was standing on the edge of something ancient, something powerful and unknowable. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure, it didn't belong. It wasn't human. The knock came again, this time softer, quieter, but I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't the door it was knocking on now. It was me. I staggered backward, slamming the door shut. I had to lock it. I had to block out whatever that thing was. I stumbled toward the lock, my fingers fumbling desperately. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I could feel the room spinning, the walls closing in around me. The knock continued, softer now, but it was still there, just outside the door. Waiting. I slammed the lock into place, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What was that thing? I backed away from the door, my hands pressed against the wall, trying to steady myself. But then, I heard it. A whisper, so faint I could barely hear it. You shouldn't have opened the door. My blood ran cold. I spun around, searching the room, but no one was there. The apartment was as empty as it had been before. But something had changed. The air was different now. Heavy, thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The silence was oppressive. What did it mean? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just triggered something I wasn't ready for. Something that was now here with me. I reached for my phone again, desperate to call Claire, to ask her to come over, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But the screen was black. Dead. I pressed the power button over and over, but it didn't respond. It was as if the phone had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving me with nothing. A cold laugh echoed in my head, as though someone were mocking me. The whisper returned, louder now. More urgent. You shouldn't have opened the door. I turned back to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The lock was still in place. The knocking had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just outside. Watching. I backed away slowly, the sound of my own footsteps in the empty apartment unnervingly loud. But then, I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach twist with dread. There, on the floor just inside the door, was a new envelope. A letter. I hadn't heard it arrive. There was no sound, no warning. I reached down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. The envelope was heavy, too heavy for just a single sheet of paper. The texture of it felt wrong against my skin. I tore it open, and once again, there was only one word inside. Leave. The word, stark and sharp, burned itself into my mind. I dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor as if it had a life of its own, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. I had no idea what was happening anymore. The fear, the confusion, the sense that I was being watched, it was all too much. My vision blurred, and my mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of the impossible. But then, through the haze of panic, one thought stood out. Leave. Was this warning? Or was it a command? And what would happen if I didn't? I stared at the letter, my breath ragged in my chest, my mind scrambling to process what was happening. The word leave was seared into my brain, a command I couldn't ignore. But how? Where could I go? What was left for me out there, if even the air inside my apartment seemed to turn against me? The shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper, stretching longer, the darkness more tangible than before. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, and I could almost hear the faintest whisper of movement, creeping, slow, like something was following me, watching me from the edges of my vision. I could still hear Claire's voice in my mind, her desperate pleas to open the door, to let her in. But the figure I had seen outside, the one lurking at the end of the hallway, had been no one I knew. It wasn't human, and that terrified me more than anything else. What if the danger had always been in the apartment, waiting for me to notice it? Was it too late to run? The words echoed in my mind, taunting me as I glanced around the apartment. The apartment I had known so well, where I had lived in peace until now. Everything felt off. The light bulb flickered above, its light too harsh, too cold. I could hear the floorboards creaking underfoot, as if someone was walking behind me, just out of sight. What if I left? I took a step backward, my feet moving on their own, drawn toward the door as though it held the answers. But the letter, I couldn't get rid of it. It was burning into my thoughts, wrapping itself around every corner of my mind. What if the letter was trying to warn me? What if the thing outside, the figure, the presence was something far worse than I could imagine? What if it had already chosen me? I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. The night sky outside was blanketed in dark clouds, the wind howling as if in agony. The street below was empty, desolate, as though the world outside had been swallowed by the same strange force that had overtaken my apartment. There was no one in sight. No sign of life. Nothing but the deafening silence. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the window. A figure. Moving just behind me, only it wasn't in the room. It was outside, in the reflection, its face a pale, blurred outline. Its eyes were dark, almost hollow. I froze. It didn't belong. None of it did. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty again. Nothing. I'm losing my mind, I thought. But the weight of the letter in my hand, the strange presence that had been lurking in every corner, the terror that gripped my chest, none of it felt like a hallucination. I ran to the door again, my mind clouded with indecision. The whispers in my head grew louder. Leave. 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 It was almost as if the apartment itself was pleading with me, urging me to step outside, to escape. But I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't want to leave. Something was holding me here, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the fear of what lay outside. Maybe it was the unknown that kept me paralyzed in place. The knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the door. It came from within the walls, a rhythmic banging that made my skin crawl. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, its very structure trying to pull me deeper into its grip. Should I leave? I staggered back, my legs weak, but my mind racing. I didn't know if I could trust myself anymore. The line between reality and madness had blurred, and I could no longer tell what was real. I glanced at the door, then back at the window, my reflection staring back at me, but the figure outside was still there. Still watching. Still waiting. It's real. Whatever this is, it's real. I looked at the letter again, my hand shaking. I had two choices, open the door and face whatever was outside, or leave, run as fast as I could, leave everything behind. But which one would be the right choice? What if both choices led to the same fate? I turned toward the door, my fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. The knock came again, louder this time. A forceful, pounding knock, like a warning. Something was waiting for me, something that had been waiting for a long time. But what if I couldn't leave? My pulse quickened. My heart raced. I couldn't do this anymore. With a sharp breath, I swung the door open. The hallway was still empty, the flickering light bulb casting strange shadows across the floor. But something was different now. The atmosphere felt denser, more oppressive. The air, thick and heavy, pressed against me from all sides, suffocating. It was as though the world beyond the door had shifted, becoming something else entirely. Something darker. I stepped outside. At first, nothing happened. The silence was deafening. The shadows seemed to stretch on forever, curling around the corners of the hall like tendrils. But then, the door slammed behind me with a loud bang, and the air around me changed, grew colder. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing clearer. They surrounded me, voices overlapping in a tangled mess of urgency and dread. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have left. You're already too late. My stomach dropped. The walls of the apartment, The walls that had seemed like home were gone. All that was left was the endless, suffocating darkness that surrounded me. I didn't know where I was anymore. All I knew was that the room I had tried to escape from was no longer real. It had become something else. Something beyond my comprehension. And now, there was no way back. What if the road you know so well suddenly led you somewhere you didn't recognize? What if it had been changed without you even knowing it? I had walked this road countless times. The path from the train station to my apartment was always the same. The same cracked pavement, the same streetlights flickering in the distance. Every evening, I found myself here, trudging through the cold night, the heavy air filled with the smell of damp asphalt and distant car exhaust. Tonight, though, there was something different. Something about the night felt wrong. It started subtly. The usual rhythm of my footsteps seemed to shift in the darkness. The familiar hum of the city, the occasional sounds of cars passing by, began to fade into an eerie silence, as if the world around me had taken a deep breath and held it. I paused, glancing around. No one was in sight. Not a single person walking along the street. The streetlights, usually a comforting presence, now seemed dimmer than usual, their light pooling into strange shadows that stretched too far across the pavement. I shook my head. It's nothing, I told myself. Just a late hour, my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't fade. The street seemed longer, its usual bends curving more sharply, as though the road itself was reshaping. The houses along this side were all familiar, yet tonight they appeared somehow distorted, as if something in their structure was off. I walked past the same bakery I always did, but the warm, familiar smell of bread was absent. Instead, there was only a faint scent of something metallic, something unsettling. I stopped, my hand on the lamppost to steady myself. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. But the more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more the world around me seemed to pull away from reality. I began walking again, but this time the air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the night was pressing in on me from all sides. Why does it feel like I'm being watched? I quickened my pace, my heart beginning to race. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should, a rhythmic thudding that didn't match my own movements. Was it just my imagination, or were there other sounds? Subtle rustling noises from the shadows, like something or someone moving just out of sight. I turned a corner, one that I had turned 100 times before, and immediately felt the change. The street was wrong. The houses were not the same, their outlines too hazy, the windows too dark. There was no light spilling out of them. No sign of life. The street, usually lined with trees, now seemed bare. The wind had stopped entirely, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The world was holding its breath. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just paranoia. Something was changing. Something was wrong. I stopped again, this time turning to look back. The street I had just come down, my street, was now out of sight, swallowed by the growing darkness. The familiar streetlights were gone. The path I had walked for years was no longer there, replaced by an endless, empty stretch of road that led nowhere. And the sounds? They had changed too. The rustling, once so distant, was now closer. Closer. I swiveled my head toward the shadows, and I could almost see something moving. I shouldn't have kept walking. I should have turned back. But I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, as though I was being pulled forward. There was a pull, a quiet force that tugged at me, pushing me deeper into the unknown. The feeling grew stronger, like the very street was alive, watching, waiting. What was it? I glanced at my watch. The time read 3:30 in the morning. It didn't make sense. It hadn't felt like I'd been walking for that long, but everything seemed different now. The atmosphere was thicker, denser. The shadows, the silence, they weren't natural. And I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what they were hiding. My breath quickened as I picked up my pace, almost breaking into a run. The street twisted, warping before my eyes. It was the same road, but not the same. Every corner, every building seemed slightly off, unrecognizable. The sounds of my own footsteps reverberated unnervingly in the cold air. The street that had once felt like home now felt like a trap, a maze that I couldn't escape. It was pulling me in, farther and farther. The lights flickered once more, casting strange shapes across the pavement, as though the shadows were stretching toward me. I turned, desperate to break free, but the path behind me was gone. It had vanished, leaving only the dark, empty road stretching on ahead. Where was I going? The rustling sound was back, closer now. It was unmistakable, footsteps, not mine. They were following me, and I had no idea where the road would lead. I couldn't stop. My feet pounded the pavement faster than I could think, moving me forward with a frantic urgency. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to escape, but where was I running to? There was no safe place here. The rustling, now unmistakably footsteps, grew louder. Too loud. They were right behind me, matching my every stride. At first, it felt like a mere coincidence, but with each step, they grew more distinct, more deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. No one. The road was empty. Yet the sound, crisp and deliberate, continued, growing faster as if someone was closing in on me. Keep moving. Don't stop. But my legs felt heavy now, weighed down by a growing sense of dread. I had never felt so exposed, so utterly vulnerable. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something unseen was watching, closing in on me. It wasn't just paranoia, it was the certainty of it. The certainty that something was wrong. I tried to focus, tried to make sense of it, but my mind refused to grasp anything. The street ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, as though it were a tunnel with no end. The shadows, thick and oppressive, seemed to flicker, warping and shifting with each fleeting moment. The streetlights above me were doing their best to illuminate the way, but the light seemed weak, almost impotent, as though the darkness itself was fighting to swallow it whole. Suddenly, there was a shift. The air around me grew colder, much colder than before, a biting chill that sunk into my skin, making every breath feel like I was inhaling ice. The shadows at the edges of the street grew deeper, stretching unnaturally toward me. I looked around, trying to find something familiar. There has to be something normal here. A landmark. A house. A street sign. But everything looked wrong. I reached out, grasping at the nearest streetlight to steady myself. It flickered, casting strange patterns across the ground. The rustling sound stopped, but it didn't feel like it had gone away. No, it felt like it had shifted. It was all around me now, behind me, to the side, beneath me. The air buzzed with tension. It's not real. It's not real. But even as I told myself that, a part of me knew it wasn't true. I started to walk again, slower this time, trying to breathe through the anxiety building in my chest. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the sensation that the ground beneath me was unstable, that the street was slowly tilting, ever so slightly, pulling me into a direction I couldn't control. The walls of houses on either side seemed to close in, the spaces between them narrowing. It was as if the world was reshaping, changing its rules just for me. I stopped once more, my heart pounding in my ears. There was something ahead of me now. I could feel it, could sense it before I even saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the middle of the road. It was too far ahead to make out any details, but it was tall, far taller than any person I had ever seen. Its silhouette was impossibly thin, stretching into the darkness like a shadow that had come to life. My breath caught in my throat. "Who? What is that?" I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't look away. The figure remained still, as if waiting for me to come closer, to make the first move. My instincts told me to run, to turn around and flee, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, it took a step forward. A single, slow step. The sound of its movement was deafening in the silence, a slow, deliberate creak that sent a shiver through my spine. No. No, no, no. I snapped out of my stupor, taking a shaky step back. But it was already moving again, not toward me, but beside me. The air around me shifted with every move it made, as though the very space around us was bending to its will. I glanced to my side, my eyes tracing the line of houses. They were starting to work too, their outlines becoming jagged, twisted. The windows seemed to stare at me, black and empty, their glass reflecting nothing but the encroaching darkness. The footsteps, they were back. But this time, they were louder. They were in front of me, behind me, beside me. Every direction was filled with the sound of someone or something walking closer. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. But deep down, I knew. I knew that it was. The figure, whatever it was real. It wasn't just in my head. The darkness swallowed the street, and I felt a cold hand, icy and unyielding, wrap around my wrist. The grip was strong, pulling me forward, dragging me closer to that figure. I tried to scream, tried to pull away, but my body wasn't my own anymore. It was as if I was being forced into this place, into this nightmare. I couldn't see what was happening now. The street had disappeared completely, replaced by an endless expanse of blackness. The figure in front of me, it was right there. Too close. Its face was a blur, but I could feel its eyes. Cold, empty eyes that pierced through me. And I couldn't look away. The grip around my wrist tightened, pulling me deeper into the void. The figure's eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were all I could focus on. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. A wave of terror swept through me as the darkness seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. My heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. What is it? What do you want? I couldn't form the words. I was paralyzed, my body frozen in place, locked in an invisible cage that pressed in from all sides. The figure's presence was overwhelming. It was like a weight in the air, thick and oppressive, forcing the very atmosphere to bend and crack. I tried to turn my head, but the movement was sluggish, unnatural. Every motion felt like I was wading through thick mud, as if the world itself was fighting me. It was as if something was pressing down on me, a force that had no shape but was everywhere at once. The figure's face began to form, slowly, impossibly slowly, as though it were emerging from the darkness itself, taking shape in pieces. First, I saw a faint outline of its features, then a blur of something long and twisted, like a fractured mirror reflecting pieces of reality I wasn't meant to see. But the eyes, they were always the same. Those hollow, unblinking eyes. They burned into me, cold and searching, as if they could see every part of me, every secret buried deep inside. A voice, low and distant, echoed through my mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it vibrated through the air, like a whisper from the void itself. You shouldn't have come here. The words sent a shiver through my spine, their meaning slipping away the moment they entered my mind. What did it mean? What was it trying to say? I wanted to scream, but the words were trapped in my throat. My body was locked in place, unable to break free. The grip on my wrist loosened slightly, but I didn't dare to move. I knew better than to try and escape. There was nowhere to go. The road had disappeared. The houses had melted away. Everything had melted away. All that remained was this suffocating void, pressing in on all sides. The air around me grew colder still, colder than it had ever been. My breath came out in white puffs, disappearing into the empty space before me. Every exhale felt like it was leaving a part of me behind. The figure's presence only grew stronger, like a storm gathering its force before it tore everything apart. I could feel the eyes on me, boring into my very soul. My skin crawled, my muscles tensed. I wanted to break free, but the terror held me in place, as if my feet were chained to the ground by invisible forces. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from whatever this thing was, but I couldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself was holding me captive. You can't leave. The voice returned, clearer now. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was real, tangible, vibrating through the air like a low hum. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't move. It was as if the air had solidified, turning into a barrier between me and the outside world. There was no escape, no release from the crushing sensation of being watched, of being consumed by whatever this thing was. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, but each breath felt heavier, as if the air was growing thicker. My chest tightened, each inhale a struggle. I tried to focus on something, anything, but the emptiness around me only seemed to expand, stretching into an endless void that had no beginning or end. The road, the houses, everything I had known, gone. All that remained was the figure, its hollow gaze burning into me, as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge something. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I gasped, but the air was suffocating, impossible to inhale. It was as if the space around me had become a vacuum, pulling the life from my body. Help me. Please, help me. The words echoed in my mind, desperate and frantic, but they felt distant, disconnected from the reality around me. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting, becoming unstable, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The figure stepped closer, its form growing sharper, more defined with each passing moment. But still, it didn't speak. Its eyes were enough. They didn't need to say anything. The weight of them, the intensity of that gaze, was enough to suffocate me, to crush me under the pressure of their emptiness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only feel. I felt every inch of my body, every muscle trembling, every nerve alight with panic. And then, the figure raised a hand. It was long, thin, and unnatural. Its fingers were twisted, jagged, like the roots of a tree grown in the dark. It reached toward me slowly, deliberately, and I couldn't look away. This is it. This is the end. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only watch as its hand drew closer, inch by inch, its fingers stretching toward me, their touch colder than anything I had ever felt before. And then, just as its hand was about to make contact, everything stopped. The world around me went still. The figure, the darkness, the void, all of it paused, suspended in time, like a breath held too long. I couldn't feel the air in my lungs. I couldn't hear anything. The silence was deafening. Everything was frozen, as if the universe itself had paused, waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But the stillness was worse than the terror that had come before it. The figure's eyes, those hollow, endless eyes, were still locked on me. I felt them even in the silence. It wasn't over. I hadn't escaped. The air around me began to shift again. And this time, I knew it was coming. Time seemed to stretch, each second like an eternity that I couldn't escape. The stillness of the world around me, so complete, so suffocating, was far more terrifying than any noise or motion. The figure's eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering. It wasn't just its presence that gripped me, it was the silence that surrounded us, the heavy weight of waiting. It was as though the universe itself had paused, holding its breath, just as I was. I could feel the tension in the air. The pressure was unbearable, pushing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Each inhale felt like it was being sucked away by something invisible, a pull from all around me, as if the space I occupied was not my own. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though it was slowly dissolving, shifting with the uncertainty of what was to come. What is this? What do you want from me? The questions floated in my mind, unanswered, unanswered by the figure, unanswered by anything. The void, the oppressive emptiness surrounding me, had no voice of its own. It was a presence without a form, a force that existed only in the spaces between my thoughts, between the flickers of my rational mind. But the figure, it was real. It was the only thing that wasn't fading. The air shifted again, growing colder. The very particles around me seemed to freeze, biting into my skin, until every inch of me ached from the cold that had no source. I shivered uncontrollably, but I couldn't look away. The figure's hand was still reaching for me, the fingers long, impossibly thin, their movements slow but deliberate, like the dragging of shadows across an unlit wall. I felt it then, the pressure of its gaze deepening, as if it were sinking into me, crawling through my skin, its cold touch reaching into the depths of my mind. The feeling was suffocating, overwhelming, and for the first time, I wondered if I was being pulled not just through space, but through time itself. The darkness around me seemed to bend, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. The road, the trees, the houses, everything I had once known, everything I thought was familiar, had become a vague outline, something I could no longer recognize. The more I tried to focus, the more everything blurred and distorted, as if the world itself was slipping away, eroding beneath me. I tried to speak, to cry out, but my voice was strangled by the air. No sound came, only the steady, unrelenting pull of that cold gaze, the figure's hand drawing nearer with each beat of my panicked heart. It was as if I were standing on the edge of reality itself. One wrong step, one wrong breath, and I would fall into the infinite black that stretched beneath me. The ground was gone, the sky, the stars, they had dissolved into nothing. All that existed was this figure, this presence that threatened to consume everything I knew. Please, I thought desperately, I have to wake up. This can't be real. But the more I tried to fight it, the deeper I sank into the horror of it all. The figure's hand, close now, so close, seemed to draw a path through the air. Every movement was impossibly slow, yet deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. It reached toward my face, the fingers like tendrils, curling and uncoiling, searching for something in me, something buried deep within. I wanted to move, to flee, but my legs were rooted to the spot. It felt as though I was tied to the very ground itself, held in place by the sheer weight of the figure's presence. I couldn't escape. There was no running, no hiding. I was utterly, completely alone in this dark expanse, with only that cold gaze pressing down on me. "What do you want from me?" I forced the words out, though they were weak, hollow in the face of the overwhelming silence. The figure's hand paused, just inches from my face, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought it would speak. But the silence deepened, thickening until it was all-encompassing, drowning out every thought in my mind. There was no answer. There was only the coldness, the ever-present weight of its stare. And then, a sound, soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't from the figure, but from the world around me. The wind? No. It was something else. A low hum, vibrating through the air, through my bones. It seemed to rise from the ground itself, a pulsing, rhythmic throb, like a heartbeat from somewhere far beyond. The figure didn't react. Its fingers continued their slow, deliberate movement, its gaze never wavering. But the sound, the hum, was getting louder. It filled my head now, reverberating against my skull. It was as though the air itself was being drawn into the center of the space, twisting and stretching. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was something physical, something real that I could feel with every fiber of my being. The world around me began to fold. The road, the trees, the blackness, they all seemed to collapse in on themselves, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. I could feel the edges of my vision warping, twisting into shapes that didn't belong, that didn't make sense. The ground underfoot felt unstable, like a wave crashing beneath me. I was losing control, losing grip on everything. No! I wanted to shout, to scream, but the words died before they could leave my throat. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic spreading through my chest like wildfire. What was happening? What was this? Was I slipping into madness? Or was there something else, something worse, happening? The hum grew louder, louder than anything else, until it was all I could hear. My vision began to distort completely. The world no longer felt real. It felt like a dream, but not the kind of dream you wake from. It was the kind of dream you were trapped in forever, unable to escape. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed by the sound, by the darkness, the figure's hand brushed against my cheek. Cold. Unyielding. The touch was like ice, but it wasn't just the cold that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was the presence behind it, the feeling that the figure was taking something from me. Something that I couldn't afford to lose. I felt a pull, deep within, something I couldn't explain, but it was enough to break me. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in this space anymore. The world was unraveling, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand caught in the wind. The cold touch on my cheek sent waves of paralysis through my body, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I could hear my heartbeat. Each thump was like a distant drum echoing through a void, out of sync with the chaos around me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything felt wrong. But then, there was a sound. It started so softly that I almost thought I imagined it. A low crackling, like dry leaves underfoot, distant but unmistakable. The air around me shifted again, colder now, and the ground beneath me gave an unsettling shift, as if the world had tilted. The landscape wasn't just bending, it was breaking. The trees, once solid, began to waver like smoke, their forms dissolving into a formless blur of shadow and light. I tried to focus, tried to hold on to the fleeting thoughts that clung to me like lifelines. What is this? What am I seeing? But my mind was betraying me. Each thought I tried to form dissipated into the thick, pressing fog of confusion that wrapped around me. I could still feel the figure's cold fingers lingering against my skin, even though it hadn't moved. Was it pulling something from me? Was it taking pieces of my mind? The hum persisted. A rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't just in my ears, it was in my bones, vibrating through every inch of my body. I could feel it deep within me, like something was crawling through my veins, spreading with a cold certainty. The more I resisted it, the stronger it became, as though it was digging its way into my soul. I closed my eyes, but the darkness didn't offer relief. It was worse. The silence behind my eyelids wasn't empty, it was filled with something. A presence I couldn't place, an awareness that seemed to reach through the cracks in my mind, seeking out my every fear, every doubt. It was like the world around me was watching, waiting, alive. But it was more than just a figure. It was the air itself, the very space I occupied. It was shifting, warping, bending towards something I couldn't understand. And then, a voice. A whisper. It wasn't the figure's voice. No, it wasn't even a voice. It was the space between the words. The empty, cold sound that scraped against my thoughts like fingers on glass. You cannot leave. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat, thick and stifled. My pulse quickened, fear rising in waves that left me gasping. Leave? What did it mean? Leave? I had been trying to leave this entire time, hadn't I? But the road had changed. There was no escape. No end. Just a growing sense of inevitability, as though I was being pulled deeper, further away from anything that resembled reality. The trees that had once stood at the edge of the path were no longer recognizable. They had transformed, shifting into grotesque shapes, twisting, writhing, like living things bound in constant motion. Some seemed to reach out toward me with skeletal arms, others loomed overhead, their limbs bent unnaturally, as if they were stretching to touch the sky. Each movement of the leaves above me sent a chill down my spine. And then another sound. A whisper of something alive, something that wasn't human. It was close, but distant, like a muffled cry, barely audible, coming from somewhere just outside of my awareness. I spun, trying to locate it, but there was nothing. No one. The silence returned. And then, the hum, louder than before, reverberating in my chest, my mind. The pulse. The beat. It was everywhere. A rhythm I couldn't escape. It was as though I had become part of it, my heartbeat synced to the unnatural frequency of the world around me. I had to get away. I had to leave. My mind screamed for escape, but there was no direction, no clear path. The road twisted in upon itself, looping endlessly. There was no horizon, no end in sight. The landscape folded into itself, shapes flickering in and out of view like half-remembered dreams. I'm not alone. The thought struck me like a jolt of electric fear, and my body froze. The figure. It was still there. I could feel it, behind me. But it wasn't just behind me anymore. It was everywhere. It had become part of the shadows, part of the very air. The very essence of the space around me seemed to warp, echoing with its presence. I couldn't see it clearly anymore. It wasn't just a figure anymore, it was a shape that existed in the folds of time, in the shifting space between worlds. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the darkness, burning into the very core of my existence. I wanted to scream, to shout, but the words never formed. The hum, that oppressive rhythm, drowned out everything. My own breath, shallow and ragged, was the only thing I could hear. I was losing myself in the noise, in the silence, in the absence of meaning. The ground beneath me cracked. I felt the air snap, as if a thin thread was severed, and the world buckled. I staggered back, my legs unsteady, but there was no place to run. The path, the road, it had changed again. It was gone, replaced by an endless chasm, a dark void that stretched into oblivion. I was standing at the edge of nothing, and I had no choice but to step forward. There was nowhere left to go. There was a room in my house, a room I had never seen before. It appeared overnight. Or perhaps, I should say, it didn't appear at all, but rather, it was something I hadn't noticed before. I'm not sure. My house had always been familiar to me, the creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the constant whisper of the wind outside my window. But this room wasn't like the others. It wasn't even part of the house as I knew it. It started with a strange feeling, a shift in the air. I was walking through the hall when I noticed that the space near the end of the corridor seemed off. I had walked down that hall countless times. I knew every inch of it. Yet, there was something unfamiliar about it. A slight, eerie emptiness. It wasn't just that I didn't remember this room, it felt as though it had always been here, hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to notice. The door was closed. But that wasn't what was odd. What was odd was that the door had never been there before. Or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe the house was playing games with my mind, as old houses tend to do. But the longer I stared at that door, the more it pulled at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The house was silent. A deep, unsettling silence. No creaking floorboards. No ticking clock. It felt as though time had stopped, like the world outside was frozen and all that existed was this doorway, this room that shouldn't have been. I should have ignored it. I should have turned around, gone back to my life, and chalked it up to some mental lapse or fatigue. But something inside me, a voice, quiet at first, but growing louder, urged me to open that door. I reached out. My hand hovered over the doorknob for what felt like an eternity. My breath came in shallow gasps, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, as if something were watching me. No, I told myself. This was ridiculous. It was just a room, a forgotten corner of the house. But when I twisted the doorknob, it creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. There was no light inside. No sound. Just an emptiness that pressed in on me from all sides, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. I stepped inside, the air instantly cooler, thick with the scent of dust and something I couldn't place, a metallic tang that stung the back of my throat. The room was bare. Nothing but walls and a floor. No furniture. No windows. No markings of any kind. Just four smooth, featureless walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. I took a step further in, the floor beneath me cold and unforgiving. The door clicked shut behind me, though I hadn't heard it move. It was then that I felt it. A presence, faint but undeniable. Something was wrong. The room, it wasn't just empty. It was hollow. There was a void in the air, an absence that gnawed at my senses. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to leave. But I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, as if the room itself was holding me in place, trapping me. I turned around, trying to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. It felt stuck, locked from the other side. My breath quickened, my chest tightening. What was happening? Was I imagining this? Was I losing my mind? I reached out again, my hand trembling, only to have it stop midway. There, just beyond my fingertips, was a shadow. A shadow that shouldn't have been there. A shadow that stretched across the wall, unnatural and wrong. It didn't belong to anything. No shape, no figure, just a dark, pulsing mass that seemed to inhale the light around it. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, too loud, too fast. I should have left. I should have found a way out. But the shadow, it moved. It shifted. I blinked and the darkness shifted again. My thoughts began to scramble. Was this a trick? Was I imagining things? I couldn't be sure anymore. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breath, trying to calm myself. But the fear in my chest grew. The shadow, it wasn't just there. It was coming closer. Slowly. I could feel its weight pressing on me. Closing in. The temperature dropped further. The metallic smell grew stronger, sharper. My pulse raced as I turned toward the walls, desperate for any sign of an exit. Any way to escape this suffocating space. But there was nothing. No escape. I turned again to face the door, but the shadow had shifted. It was at the edge of the doorway now, stretching its dark limbs toward me. I could hear something, a faint scraping noise, as if something was dragging along the floor. My mind raced to make sense of it, but it couldn't. It was like the room was trying to suffocate me, to close in on me. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was so soft, at first, I thought it was my imagination. But it grew louder. A low murmur, like a voice speaking just out of reach, just on the edge of my perception. The words were indistinct, fragmented, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice I had heard before. A voice I should have never heard in this house. A voice from the past. I turned to face the shadow once more, but it was no longer a shadow. It had taken shape. I didn't know whether to scream or to run. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the presence in the room, the thing that was waiting for me, moved closer. I had opened the door. Now, there was no way out. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had turned to stone, every muscle locked in place, but my mind screamed to escape. There, in the corner of the room, was the thing. The presence. It was more than just a shadow now. It had taken shape, its form was wrong, twisted in a way I couldn't fully comprehend. A figure so vague, yet disturbingly familiar. I tried to force myself to take a step back, but my legs refused to cooperate. My fingers felt ice cold against the door handle, but when I tried to pull, it was as though the door had melted into the frame. It didn't budge. I was trapped. The room seemed to close in on me, its walls narrowing slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My eyes darted around the space. The air around me was thick, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. The floor beneath my feet seemed colder now, as though the very foundations of the house were freezing. And then, that whisper. It came again, louder this time, clearer, but still distorted. The voice seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed in the corners of the room, slithered through the cracks in the walls, and even vibrated in the air itself. My breath quickened. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling my name. The whisper grew, no longer just a faint murmur, but a soft, persistent chant, repeating the same name over and over. At first, I thought it was my own name, but something about the way it sounded wrong. It was too familiar, too intimate, like a memory that had been buried deep, clawing its way back to the surface. Mark. It was my name, I realized, but it felt like something else, something sinister. Something that belonged to a past I had long since forgotten, or perhaps a past I had wanted to forget. But I had no memory of this voice, this place. My mind was a blur, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but the room wouldn't let me move. I tried to call out, to shout for help, but my voice caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the walls, searching for any sign of an exit. But they felt wrong, slick, unnaturally smooth, and cold. As I touched them, a chill shot through my fingertips, numbing my skin. And then, I heard it. A scraping sound. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragged across glass. It came from the wall in front of me. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise was growing louder, closer, until it was so deafening I could feel it vibrating in my bones. The scraping continued, then a sudden, sharp crack. It was as if the walls themselves were shifting, bending, warping. I backed away, my chest tightening with panic. The room, this empty room, was not empty at all. It was alive. I pressed my back to the cold door, desperate, my breathing ragged as I searched the dark for any sign of movement. The figure in the corner, what was it? It hadn't moved, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The scraping grew louder again, closer, this time accompanied by a thud. A sound so real, so solid, I could almost feel it in my own body. I turned, heart racing, to see the shadows against the far wall twitching. The space in front of me seemed to stretch, expand, distorting the room even further. It was no longer just a room. It was something else. Something ancient. The voice came again, but now it was joined by others. A chorus, overlapping, distant but unmistakably present. The words jumbled together, unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. They were calling me, pleading with me, demanding something from me. Mark, you have to understand. My breath caught in my throat. The voice that spoke wasn't just familiar, it was intimate. I turned around in a frantic blur. I couldn't think. I needed to get out, to leave, to escape. But the walls, they were closing in on me. And then, a figure stepped out from the darkness. Not just a shadow anymore, but a person. A woman. Her silhouette was blurry at first, like trying to look through a fogged window. But as she stepped closer, the edges of her form became more distinct. I recognized her. It was her, the woman from my past. I didn't know how I knew her. My memories seemed to be fading away, slipping through my fingers like sand. But I couldn't deny the truth of it. She was standing right there, just inches away from me, her eyes dark and hollow, like empty wells. Her lips didn't move, but the whispers, her voice, continued. "Why did you leave?" The words were chilling, as though the room itself was pulling them from her mouth. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. No escape. My thoughts blurred. My heart raced. And as the walls closed in around me, I realized there was something in this room that I had buried, something that wanted to come back. Something I didn't want to remember. The room wasn't just empty. It was a prison, and I had been locked in it for years. My pulse was hammering in my ears, drowning out everything else, but I couldn't move. I could only stare at her, this woman who had stepped out of the darkness, her figure so familiar yet so distorted in my mind. The silence that followed her appearance was suffocating, almost as if the house itself had stopped breathing. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. She stood there, unmoving, her dark eyes locked onto mine with a coldness that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My mouth was dry, like all the moisture had been drained from my body. "Why did you leave?" Her words echoed again, not from her lips, but from everywhere, within the walls, in the floor beneath my feet, in the air I breathed. They reverberated in my skull like a broken record, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to ask her who she was, why she was here, but the words wouldn't form. The room, it felt wrong. The walls pressed in on me, as if they were closing around me, constricting my lungs. The air felt thick, like it had substance, as though it were trying to suffocate me. I could feel the weight of the house itself, the old, decaying wood groaning beneath its own age and secrets. Her gaze didn't waver. It was as though she was waiting for something, waiting for me to remember. But what was it? What had I forgotten? I staggered back, my legs weak beneath me. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, but still, I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The room seemed to be shifting around me. The floor beneath my feet felt as though it was undulating, like a living thing. Every creak, every groan of the house was amplified, as if the building itself were coming alive, reacting to her presence. The shadow that had lingered in the corner of the room, the one I had noticed earlier, moved. I barely caught a glimpse of it, but there was no mistaking it now. It was a shape, a figure, crawling along the wall in a way that made my stomach churn. "What is that?" I wanted to run. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, and my mind was a blur of panic and confusion. "Why did you leave?" The woman repeated, her voice louder now, more insistent. But this time, it wasn't just her speaking. The house joined in, the floorboards creaking in time with her words, the walls groaning in a low hum. The air thickened, pressing down on me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound was inescapable. It was as if the very walls of this house were alive, aware of my presence, and angry at it. "Answer me," she whispered, and this time, her voice was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the empty, decaying room, its corners stretching in impossible directions. It felt like I was drowning in it, suffocating beneath its weight. My mind was unraveling. The room was warping, twisting. I could see the faint outline of the woman in the corner of my vision, but when I turned to face her, she was gone. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the walls, my mind struggling to hold on to any semblance of reality. I needed to get out. I had to. But every way I turned, I was met with the same endless corridor of emptiness. The door, where was the door? I spun in a circle, my breath ragged. The walls, they were moving again. I could feel the very foundation of the house trembling beneath my feet. The shadows twisted and writhed, and the whispering voices swirled in my head, growing louder with each passing second. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. I could hear her now, not just speaking, but singing. It was a low, haunting melody that seemed to come from every corner of the room, rising in volume, vibrating through my skull. And then, the truth hit me like a weight to the chest. This wasn't just a room. It was a memory. A moment in time I had long buried, something I didn't want to face. The woman. I recognized her now. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone from my past, someone I had lost. She was my sister. But I hadn't thought about her in years. Not since that night. Not since the accident. The accident. The word echoed in my mind like a scream. I had tried to forget. I had buried it so deep, locked it away. The house had been a refuge. But now it was clear. She was here because I had left her behind. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but the grief was not what consumed me. It was something darker, something far worse. Something in the room was shifting, moving around me. It wasn't just the air. It wasn't just the walls. It was her. The figure in the corner, the shadow that had been lingering. It moved again, crawling closer, its outline sharpening into something more solid. I could see it now, her pale, hollow face staring at me, her eyes vacant but accusing. Her mouth stretched into a smile that was anything but comforting. You left me. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream. The walls themselves screamed with her as if they were tearing apart, begging for release. I backed away, stumbling toward the door, my hands still gripping the cold, unyielding handle. I wrenched it open, but the room didn't change. The shadows followed me, crawling across the floor, the walls bending closer. There was no escape. The woman's voice was all around me now, inescapable, relentless. You cannot run from me, Mark. You can never run from me. I didn't know where I was. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls warping and shifting, creating an endless maze I could never escape. Each time I thought I was moving toward the exit, I found myself back in the same place. The same dimly lit hallway, the same creaking floorboards beneath my feet. The door slammed shut behind me, the echo reverberating in my ears, leaving me with nothing but silence and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out. But the walls were alive now, and they were watching me. I could feel them. It was as if the house itself was holding me prisoner, playing with my mind. The shadows moved in the corners of my vision, no longer static but alive, bending in impossible directions. Each flicker of movement sent a shiver of dread down my spine. Why was this happening? My mind raced with confusion and panic. My sister, Lena, her face was burned into my mind. The smile, the way her eyes had drilled into me, the accusations in her voice. I couldn't escape her now, couldn't escape the truth. She was dead, and I had killed her. The weight of that thought slammed into me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The house seemed to pulse with it, a living entity feeding on my guilt and fear. I had tried to move on, tried to pretend that night never happened. But the house, this place, wouldn't let me forget. I stumbled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise oppressive silence. The floor creaked beneath me, the house groaning like it was waking from a deep slumber. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was thickening, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like the rustling of paper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but I could feel the heat of it against my skin. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until it was impossible to ignore. Mark. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It swirled around me, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I froze. The voice. It was her. Mark. It was a low, pleading sound, full of pain. But there was something wrong about it, something twisted. I could feel her presence, her cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, my heart racing. There was nothing. Just empty air. But the voice didn't stop. Why did you leave me? It was coming from the walls now, the sound vibrating through the floor, the ceiling, the very foundation of the house. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, inside my thoughts. I could hear her clearly now, louder than ever. I didn't mean to, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. I didn't mean to. You left me. The words repeated over and over again, building to a maddening crescendo. The air was thick now, almost suffocating, and I could feel the house closing in on me. It was as if the walls were moving, shifting, surrounding me. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway stretched before me, but there was something new now. A door. It hadn't been there before. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs moved of their own accord, dragging me toward the door. I reached for the handle, feeling the cold metal against my fingers, and pushed it open. The room was dark, almost completely devoid of light, except for the faint glow of something shimmering at the far end. I stepped inside, my eyes immediately drawn to it. A mirror. I couldn't see my reflection at first. The glass was fogged, clouded with an unnatural mist. But as I stepped closer, the mist began to clear, revealing a figure behind me. Lena. She was standing there, just behind me, her pale face staring back at me through the mirror. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. No. I wanted to turn, to run, but I couldn't. The reflection was frozen, stuck in the glass. I raised a trembling hand, and the figure in the mirror mirrored my movements. But it wasn't me who was moving. It was her. Lena's reflection began to shift, warping and distorting in a way that made my stomach turn. Her once peaceful face twisted into something monstrous, her eyes darkening with rage. She opened her mouth, but this time it wasn't a scream that came out. It was a low, guttural growl, like something not quite human. Her hand reached out, pressing against the glass from the other side. Her fingers stretched, elongating into something unnatural, something monstrous. No, please. I staggered back, but I was trapped. The room was closing on me again. The walls were too close. The air too thick. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I couldn't breathe. The glass in the mirror cracked, a long, jagged line running through it, and the reflection, no, the thing on the other side, stepped forward. The room exploded in chaos. A flash of white light. A deep, gut-wrenching noise. And then, silence. I opened my eyes, gasping for air. My hands were trembling, my body soaked in cold sweat. The room had changed again. The mirror was gone. The door was closed. And I wasn't alone. I could feel her again. Her presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The house had remembered. And it wasn't letting me go. I didn't dare move. The silence around me was suffocating, thick as the air in an abandoned tomb. My mind was reeling, my senses heightened to the point of agony. Every creak in the floorboards felt like an earthquake. Every breath I took seemed louder than the last, an intrusion in the stillness that threatened to break me. Lena's presence, the thing that was once her, loomed over me. I could feel her watching, feel her fingers brushing against the edges of my consciousness. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck rising in response to something unseen, something lurking in the dark. I forced myself to look around. The room had shifted again. What had once been a narrow hallway now stretched out impossibly far, as though the house itself had expanded in the time I had spent inside that cursed room. The walls seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, their surface breathing, rising and falling like a heart. The shadows were longer now, deeper, like they were reaching for me. The door behind me was gone. The mirror, too. It was as though the house had swallowed them whole. There was nothing but the oppressive darkness and the sickening feeling that I wasn't alone, that I had never been alone. Lena, I whispered her name out loud, barely able to form the words. The sound of her name sent a shiver down my spine, not because of the memory of her, but because I could feel it, her answer. A cold breath against the back of my neck. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Only the shadow of the hallway behind me, stretching endlessly. The silence mocked me, every corner of the house taunting my sanity. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on me, inch by inch, suffocating me with their weight. I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against the cold wall, my fingers trembling as they grazed the smooth, unnatural surface. The wall didn't feel like plaster or wood. It felt soft, like skin. The skin of the house. No, it can't be real. This place can't be real. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to shut out the growing whispers that filled the room. The sound was like the rustling of leaves in a windless forest, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you allowed it into your mind. I could hear them now. Words, distorted and unclear, but unmistakably human. Their tone was not one of anger, but something worse. Something far more chilling. Help me. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The voice sounded like Lena, but it wasn't her. It couldn't be her. There was something wrong with the voice, something wrong with the way it echoed in my head. It wasn't real. It wasn't possible. But then I felt it again. The cold breath, this time more pronounced, more urgent. The air around me shifted, as if something was moving, someone was closer than I dared to believe. I forced myself to turn, despite the terror crawling up my spine. And there it was. A figure in the doorway. It was a silhouette, outlined by the dim light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. I couldn't make out any features, only the outline of a person. No, not a person, a shape. Thin, hunched, and wrong. The figure swayed slightly, as if it were breathing too. Like it was alive. Or pretending to be. Lena? I took a step forward, trembling, and the figure moved. It didn't walk. It slid. It moved impossibly fast, a blur of motion that shouldn't have been possible in the space of that tiny room. My heart slammed against my ribcage as it came closer. I could see now. I could see the eyes, glowing white, like pale lanterns in the dark, set deep within a face that was nothing but shadow. The face twisted, contorting, until I could make out the faintest outline of the person it had once been, Lena. But not her. Not anymore. You left me, the voice whispered, so quiet that I could hardly hear it. But it felt louder, pounding against my skull. You left me. I screamed, but it came out as a strangled gasp. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't move in response. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I couldn't breathe. You didn't even try to save me. The voice was louder now, clearer. It was no longer Lena's voice, but something else. Something far older. And deeper. The walls shook, the house groaning as if it were alive, as if it were aware of my fear, feeding on it. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, but the figure was faster, always faster, closing in on me. The eyes. Those eyes, they burned into me, pulling me into their hollow depths. I couldn't look away. I couldn't escape. Help me, it whispered again, and this time the voice was clear. I heard the desperation, the pain, the agony. But it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of them. Dozens, hundreds, filling the air around me, their cries growing louder, overwhelming. The darkness pressed in, and I could feel the weight of it crushing me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. There was only this empty house, this endless nightmare. I looked around, frantic, searching for an exit, for a way out. But there was nothing. Only darkness. I turned back to the figure. It was closer now, standing just inches from me. The glow of its eyes was blinding. I reached out, desperate to stop it, but my hand passed right through it, through the thing that was once Lena. It was cold. Too cold. And then everything stopped. For a moment, I was suspended in time. The voices faded. The eyes dimmed. The house was silent. And then, slowly, like a breath held too long, it all came crashing back. The walls began to vibrate, the floor buckling beneath me. A deep, guttural sound, like the growl of a beast, filled the air. The house was alive. And it was angry. I don't know when it started, but I could feel it, the creeping unease that settled into my chest every time the sun went down. It wasn't something you could put into words exactly. Just a slow shift in the atmosphere, the air thickening with every passing day. The sounds from the neighbors, from the walls around me, they began to change. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the old pipes in this building, groaning under pressure. But then, it kept happening. Have you ever been somewhere where the noise feels wrong? Like a dog's bark that doesn't quite sound like a bark? Or a phone ringing just a little off key, like the tune is stretched out of tune? That's what it felt like, only it was worse. The sounds from the neighboring apartments, they weren't normal. They weren't human. It started with the scraping. That relentless, gnawing sound. I could hear it through the walls at first, faint but unmistakable. Like something or someone dragging a heavy object across the floor. A chair, maybe, but it didn't stop. It went on for hours. In the dead of night. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I thought it was just a neighbor doing something late. Maybe moving furniture around or some sort of home improvement project that had gone into the night. But the more I listened, the more the sound unsettled me. The rhythm was off. It didn't sound like furniture being moved. It was too deliberate, too continuous. And then there were the screams. At first, they were faint, like distant echoes, muffled by the thick walls of the building. But as the days went by, they became clearer, sharper. A woman, I thought, screaming in pain or fear. I didn't know for sure. Was it someone's television blaring too loudly at hours? A nightmare in the next apartment over? Maybe someone having a bad dream? But then, the screams stopped being just screams. They turned into something worse. Twisted. I'd lie in bed, trying to block out the noise, telling myself it was nothing. Just the usual noises of a building. Old walls. Old floors. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, it all clicked. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep despite the constant scraping from the apartment next door. My eyes were half shut, but my ears were wide open. Every squeak of the floor, every creak of the ceiling, each noise seemed to wind me tighter. Then, just as I thought I might be able to drift off, it came again. The scream. It pierced through the walls with such clarity that I shot upright, heart pounding. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a sound of pain or fear. No, this scream was something else. It was too animalistic. Too guttural. It was a scream of someone or something losing its grip on its humanity. I froze. My throat tightened. I had to swallow, but it felt like I couldn't breathe. Was it coming from the apartment above me? Or was it next door? I couldn't tell. The sound twisted, turning into a howl, followed by an almost mechanical scraping sound again. The noise stopped abruptly. My head was pounding now, and my skin felt too tight, too aware of every little sensation. Every creak of the building seemed like it was moving closer to me. I turned my head towards the window, almost desperate for some fresh air, but the room felt too small, too stifling. The outside world felt so far away. I didn't move. I couldn't. There was a faint sound in the hallway outside my door. A soft thud, followed by a quiet scratching. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I waited, straining to hear. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was it possible? Could it really be what I thought? I had to know. I had to check. But I didn't want to move. I was paralyzed with fear. The sound outside my door continued, a shuffling, dragging noise that grew louder with each passing second. It was almost as though it was moving towards me, circling, waiting for me to make a sound, to make a mistake. I gripped the edge of my blanket tighter. My whole body tensed. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest, and yet the only thing I could do was listen. Listen to the silence that followed the scraping. It felt like an eternity before the noise finally stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I could hear my own breath, shallow and erratic, but no sounds beyond that. The darkness seemed to close in around me. Then, the door handle turned. I held my breath. My pulse was deafening in my ears. There was no way. I was imagining things. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. The door rattled. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. My body was frozen in place. The door rattled again, more violently this time. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. It wasn't real. It can't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look at the door. My body was trembling now, shaking uncontrollably. The noise stopped again. The silence was worse than the sound, suffocating and heavy. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The next thing I knew, I was on my feet, heading toward the door without even thinking. My hand was on the knob before I realized what I was doing. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me on the other side. But I had to know. I had to understand what was happening in this building. What I was hearing. I twisted the knob, and the door opened. The door creaked open, and I immediately regretted it. The hallway was empty. The faint yellow light from the overhead bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with dust, and a strange, musty odor lingered in the stale silence. It was almost as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. I stepped out cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling like it might betray me. I scanned the hallway, eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The scraping sound had stopped, but that didn't mean I was safe. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. I quickly glanced down the hall. To the left, the stairs led down to the ground floor. To the right, the hall stretched on toward the other apartments. The door to the unit next to mine stood closed, but I knew it wasn't locked. The idea of checking it, of knocking, seemed insane, yet the urge to do something, anything, was overwhelming. What was happening here? The sounds I had been hearing, they had to come from somewhere. And it wasn't just my imagination anymore. I took a breath, steeling myself. With shaky fingers, I reached for the handle of the neighboring apartment's door and gave it a slight push. The door opened with a soft squeak. Inside, everything seemed unnervingly normal. The same dusty air hung in the room, thick with the scent of stale coffee and unwashed dishes. The lights were dim, casting long, foreboding shadows across the furniture. The living room was empty, but the muffled sounds of someone, stirring in the bedroom at the far end of the apartment caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, but the sounds coming from the bedroom were unmistakable. Heavy breathing. Low, guttural groans. A scraping sound, like nails against wood. I froze. The groaning seemed to intensify, rising in pitch. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was something wrong. I felt an icy chill creep up my spine as I stood there, barely able to move. The noise from the bedroom became louder, more urgent. The scraping grew more frantic, more erratic. Whatever was in there, it was in pain. Or worse. Before I could react, the door to the bedroom slowly creaked open. My breath caught in my throat as the figure appeared in the doorway. It was a person. Or at least, it looked like a person. But something was horribly off. The figure was hunched over, its skin pale and slick with what seemed to be some kind of sweat. Its eyes, sunken and hollow, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Its mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream, lips pulled back in a way that no human mouth should be able to stretch. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then it made a sound, a noise like nothing I've ever heard before. It was a low, rasping hiss, followed by another scraping noise. The figure's hands, now long, elongated claws, dragged across the floor as it began to move towards me. There was no other sound in the apartment, no other movement, just this one horrific thing inching closer with unnatural speed. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as the figure stopped, only a few feet away from me. Its hollow eyes never left mine, and I could see now that its mouth, it was trying to speak. But it wasn't words. It was a gargled, choking noise, as though something had died inside it long ago. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, it lunged. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my feet as I scrambled for the door. My heart was racing in my chest, my mind barely able to process what was happening. The figure reached out, its claws scraping against the doorframe, and for one terrifying moment, I thought it might catch me. But no! I made it out. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, the sound of my breath ragged and wild in the thick air. I stood there, trembling, staring at the door to the apartment. I didn't know what that thing was, whether it was real or some kind of nightmare come to life. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stay here. I backed away from the door, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The hallway was so quiet now. Too quiet. The scraping noises, the groans, everything had stopped. It was like the building had gone back to sleep, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. I couldn't just ignore this. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. And yet, as I looked down the hallway, back toward my apartment, I realized that I had no idea where to go, no idea who to talk to. No one would believe me. I was alone. And the sound of the scraping had started again. The scraping sound had returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the apartment next door. No, this time it was different. It was coming from the walls. The very walls of the hallway themselves seemed to groan as though they were alive. The noise slithered through the cracks in the plaster, growing louder with every passing second, every breath I took. I stumbled back into my apartment, heart hammering in my chest, every muscle in my body begging me to run. But where? There was nowhere to go. I slammed the door behind me, but the noise didn't stop. It seemed to follow me, seeping through the very foundation of the building. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The scraping was now accompanied by something else, a faint whispering. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably there. It was as though something, or someone, was talking, no, screaming from within the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, straining to hear. It sounded distant, faint, yet urgent. I could almost catch a word or two, but they didn't make sense. It was like a language I didn't understand. But then, in a sharp burst of clarity, one word cut through the fog of panic. Help. My heart stopped. The whispering stopped. Everything stopped. The scraping. The voices. The silence was deafening, suffocating. I drew back from the wall, my breath shallow and uneven. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was asking for help? Was it the same thing I had seen next door? Had it been trapped in the walls all this time, waiting, scratching, calling out for salvation? No, I couldn't think like that. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The world outside my apartment, this building, it wasn't the same as it had been when I first moved in. There were things here, things lurking in the dark, behind the walls, in the spaces between the floors. The lights flickered again, momentarily plunging the room into darkness. I froze, eyes wide, heart pounding in my ears. When the light returned, everything seemed different. The shadows in the corners of the room were longer, darker, more tangible. They seemed to shift and stretch toward me, as if they were alive. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. A loud, frantic knock. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. I had no idea who it could be. The building was supposed to be empty. No one had visited in days. The fear that had been steadily creeping up my spine now spread through my veins like ice. Who would knock like that, with such urgency? I didn't move. Another knock. And another. Each one louder, more desperate. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. Slowly, I walked to the door, each step heavy and deliberate, as though I were walking toward my own doom. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, I heard something from the other side. A whisper. Soft. Please, you have to help me. The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't human. It was hollow. It was a voice that had been lost to time, to something far older than any living being. My hand hovered over the knob. Should I open it? What if it was that thing from next door? Or worse, what if it was something else entirely? I took a deep breath. I had no choice. I had to know. I had to face it. I opened the door, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty hallway, the dim lights flickering above me. No figure. No face. Just the walls and the deafening silence. I stepped outside, confusion clouding my mind. I scanned the hallway, eyes darting from one end to the other. There was no sign of movement. No one was there. The knocking had stopped, but the whispering hadn't. It was coming from inside the walls now, louder than ever, each word more insistent. Help, help, help. It was impossible. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening, what was behind this madness. I hurried toward the staircase, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the building. The walls seemed to hum with energy, as though they were alive with secrets that had been hidden for years, maybe decades. As I reached the ground floor, a thought struck me. What if I wasn't the only one hearing it? What if the others, the neighbors, had been hearing it too? I turned to the door to the apartment below mine. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Should I knock? Should I go in? I had to. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed answers. I pushed the door open. The apartment was a mess, the lights dim and flickering. The furniture was overturned, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The smell was so strong it made my stomach turn. But what made my skin crawl was the sight of the walls. There were strange marks on the walls, dark, smudged shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there, in the center of the room, was something I'll never forget. A figure. Hunched over, just like the thing next door. But this one was different. Its eyes, glowing, bright, unnatural, were fixed on me. And its mouth, stretched impossibly wide, opened. You shouldn't have come. The figure in front of me didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't just in the room, it was in my mind, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, threatening to suffocate me with fear. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in that moment with the thing that was not quite human. The glow of its eyes intensified, flickering in a strange rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't just looking at me, it was studying me, as if it knew everything about me, my fears, my weaknesses. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes. It felt like they were pulling me closer, dragging me into their emptiness. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls, once familiar, now pressed in like the jaws of a trap. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of rot and decay. I couldn't breathe properly. Every inhale felt like I was suffocating on the very atmosphere. Then, the creature spoke again. Its voice was raspy, like the sound of something dragged across rough stone, but it was laced with a chilling calm. You don't belong here. The words wrapped around my mind like a vice, tightening with each syllable. My chest tightened, and I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, my mouth unwilling to form any words. But the creature wasn't waiting for a response. It began to move slowly, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it straightened, its body cracking like the sound of bones breaking. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs stretching and bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. It was more shadow than flesh, its form constantly shifting, as if it were not entirely here, but slipping between worlds. And I could hear it, beneath its movements, an unsettling sound, like a distant scream, faint but growing louder, like a chorus of tormented souls. I forced my legs to move, backing away, but the door was too far. The creature's eyes followed every step, every breath I took. My heart hammered louder and louder, drowning out everything else. But then, suddenly, the whispering started again. Help me, please. I flinched, the words too familiar. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was in the walls again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was closer. It was right there, behind me, in the cracks and the shadows. My mind raced. Could it be someone else? Was there someone trapped here too? Someone else who heard the voices? Who had seen the creature? The whispering grew more frantic. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of that apartment, away from whatever the hell was happening. But my body refused to listen. I couldn't tear myself away from the creature. I could feel its presence drawing closer. Every second, the air felt colder, heavier. Without thinking, I spun around, searching desperately for any way out. But the room was the same, twisted and unfamiliar, the walls creeping toward me like they were alive. The creature's thin mouth curled into something that resembled a smile, but it was wrong. It wasn't a smile that belonged to any living thing. You can't leave. You've already entered. Its voice felt like a cold hand on my spine. A jolt of panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, crashing into something solid. The wall. It wasn't the wall anymore, though. It felt different. It felt wrong. The wallpaper peeled away beneath my touch, revealing a dark, moist surface beneath. It wasn't just a wall, it was something else. Something alive. I gasped, pulling my hand away, but the wall didn't feel like it had before. It was warm, wet, like flesh. The figure took a slow step toward me, and the room seemed to distort with its movements. The space between us stretched unnaturally. The lights flickered again, plunging me into complete darkness for a brief moment. When they returned, the creature had moved closer. Its eyes, still glowing, were right in front of me. I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and foul. It's too late. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with fear, thick with the promise of something horrible. The walls pulsed like a living thing, as though they were breathing. And then I heard it, another voice, this time not from the walls, but from the apartment next door. It was the sound of a woman crying. The same woman from earlier. Please, help me. I can't hold on much longer. My heart slammed into my chest, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the choice. Should I help her? Could I even survive whatever this was? I turned to the door again, but the creature's laughter echoed in my ears, low and terrifying. You think you can escape? You've already heard too much. There's no going back now. The walls were changing. The apartment was no longer just a room. It was a maze. The space itself twisted, the door I'd been heading toward now gone. The apartment was shifting, folding in on itself, moving as though it had a life of its own. I turned toward the window. Maybe I could escape through there. But as I rushed to it, I saw it. The window was covered in black, thickened glass, as though something had pressed against it from the other side, sealing it shut. The apartment had sealed itself off, trapping me inside. I couldn't get out. I had nowhere to run. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples as I stood there, staring at the sealed window. The air felt thick and stifling, pressing down on my chest like an invisible hand. Every breath I took felt heavier than the last, as if the very air in this place was alive, suffocating me. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. Panic swirled in my mind like a storm, threatening to swallow me whole. The creature behind me was still there, its eyes never leaving me, its presence a cold weight in the room. I could feel it growing closer again, its elongated limbs stretching as if to reach out and grab me. The walls were shifting. The walls were moving. I turned quickly, my mind racing for an escape. I had to get out, but the door was still gone. The room was like a maze that changed every time I turned my head. Nothing was familiar. The hallway outside the apartment, where I'd walked just minutes before, was now a distant memory. There was no way out. Then I heard it again. Help, please. The voice from the apartment next door, the woman. She sounded weaker now, as if whatever she was facing had drained her of strength. I could feel her desperation. It was like an invisible thread pulling at me, urging me to move, to help, to do something. But how could I help her when I was trapped myself? The creature in the corner of my eye seemed to sense my internal struggle. Its mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, something far too wide, too inhuman. It took a slow step forward, its limbs bending in grotesque angles, making creaking noises like dry branches snapping. You can't save her, it rasped. You can't save anyone. You're already part of this now. You belong to the walls. The walls. I didn't want to believe it, but I could feel it deep in my bones. The apartment was no longer just a space, it had become something else. Something alive. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were pulsing. They were breathing. I spun around, frantically searching for any way out, but the room kept shifting, like it was mocking me, playing some twisted game. The door, the window, nothing made sense. The space was warping in impossible ways, and I was its prisoner. The whispers were louder now, and I could feel them pressing in on me. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls or from the apartment next door, but they felt like they were all around me. Don't fight it. The voice was low and calming, yet laced with an unsettling menace. It was the voice of someone who knew everything, who knew me. I could almost see the shadows around me begin to twist, forming shapes. Faces. Eyes. We're all here, waiting. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around, my gaze locking onto one of the walls. It was no longer solid. It was alive. The wallpaper rippled as though something was pushing against it from the inside, trying to break free. I staggered back, my breath shallow. And then I saw it. A face pressed against the wall, an outline, distorted, barely visible through the shifting surface. The eyes were wide, bulging with terror. Its mouth was open, silently screaming, as if begging for help. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but it didn't matter. It was real. It was right there. My throat went dry. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The walls were alive with faces, voices, memories, all merging into one terrifying reality. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape this place. You're never leaving, the creature whispered, its voice a low growl. We all stay here. Forever. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me. There was nothing left to do. No way out. I glanced one last time at the apartment door, at the place where I thought I had seen a woman. But now, even that was gone. The walls had closed around it. I was completely surrounded, suffocated by the suffocating pressure of this thing, this presence. And then, the woman's voice came again. This time, it wasn't from the apartment next door. It was right behind me. Help me, please, don't leave me. I whirled around. There was no one there. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing, shallow and frantic. But I could feel something. Something in the silence. The walls, they were watching me. I looked back at the faces in the walls. The eyes were everywhere, locked on me. And I realized, with growing horror, that they weren't just trapped in the walls. They were waiting, watching, hoping. And I knew then that I wasn't the first to hear the cries. I wasn't the first to be pulled into this nightmare. I was just the next. The walls closed in once more, and this time I could feel them around me, closing, tightening. I was never going to leave. It all started with a single, simple question. What if someone was watching me? I remember the moment vividly, the way the light from the street lamp outside filtered through the small window above my kitchen sink. I stood there, hands frozen over a half-empty mug of coffee, staring at the letters in my mailbox. Everything in my life had been routine. I was just another person, trying to make sense of the world, when that question, what if someone was watching me, crept into my mind. It wouldn't leave me, no matter how hard I tried to push it aside. The mailbox was an ordinary one, nestled just outside the building, barely noticeable against the row of similar boxes. There was nothing special about it. No reason to feel uneasy. But that night, as I approached it, I felt an unsettling chill creep up my spine. It was the letter that made my stomach tighten. It was a simple, brown envelope with no return address, and yet something about it felt off. The handwriting on the front was neat, the letters sharp and precise. Not like anything I'd ever seen before. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. I wanted to ignore it, to forget it. But I couldn't. There was a sense of urgency about it, something that tugged at my gut. Finally, I opened it. Inside, the letter was short, only a few lines long, but each word burned into my mind like acid. I know what happened. I know what you did. You can't run from the past. That was all. No signature, no further explanation. Just those words. My breath hitched. I could feel my pulse racing, a strange nausea curling in my stomach. The letter slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the ground. My hand shook as I bent to pick it up. The words. What did they mean? What did they know? I thought about it, about my past, the things I had buried deep, the things I hadn't spoken of in years. I hadn't told anyone about that night. It was a secret I kept locked away, forgotten even by my own mind. But now it was there, staring me in the face. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had to calm down. But then I heard something, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned, half expecting someone to be standing there, but the hallway behind me was empty. The silence was suffocating. My heart pounded as I glanced down at the letter in my hand. I was alone. But that voice, that letter, kept whispering in my mind. I knew that this wasn't just some prank. No. Someone knew. Someone had been watching me. I could feel it. I wasn't alone anymore. I walked back into my apartment, the letter still clutched in my hand. The world around me felt different now, distorted, as if reality itself had shifted. The quiet was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, was amplified in my ears. There was a note of finality to the silence, as though everything I had once known was slowly unraveling. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway. But there was no one there. Just the empty apartment that I had always known. Just the same room, the same walls, the same shadows. But something was wrong. The letter was still in my hand, its message echoing in my mind. It was impossible to ignore. And then, as I looked down at it again, I saw something else, something that I hadn't noticed before. There was a faint smudge of ink on the bottom corner of the page, a blurry shape that seemed almost familiar. A footprint. Or maybe a handprint. It couldn't be. The letter had come through the mailbox. But the footprint, it was unmistakable. It was real. I backed away from the letter, my hands trembling. How could this be happening? How could someone have known? How could they have found me? And just like that, the shadows in the corners of my apartment seemed to grow deeper, the darkness thickening. My eyes darted around the room. The walls felt too close. The silence was too heavy. I was no longer just reading a letter. I was being watched. And that thought was enough to break me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood frozen in the middle of my apartment, the letter still clutched in my hands, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. The room, once a safe haven, now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was inching closer. It wasn't just the words on the letter that riled me, but the sudden weight of the past crashing back into my present. It had been years since I thought about what happened, but now it was like the past had never truly left. I set the letter down on the kitchen counter, my eyes flicking to the small smudge of ink in the corner. The footprint. It couldn't be real. No one could have gotten that close to me. I hadn't heard anyone at the door. Yet the ink was there, unmistakable. I reached for the letter again, examining the print more closely. It wasn't just a mark, it was a message. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I had to be imagining it. Maybe it was nothing more than an accident, a smudge made by the postman, or even the paper being folded. But I couldn't ignore the truth gnawing at me. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me. I slammed my hand down on the counter in frustration. What did I know about the past? About that night? Why was this happening now? I moved here to escape it all. To start fresh. But this letter, these footprints, were dragging me back into the nightmare I thought I'd left behind. Suddenly, I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but growing louder. A soft, uneven tapping sound coming from the direction of the hallway. My breath hitched. It was like someone was dragging their foot across the floor. Slow, deliberate. Too slow. I turned towards the sound. The apartment was still empty, everything just as I had left it. There was no one there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sound stopped. Silence. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It felt charged, tense. I reached for my phone, dialing a number without thinking. Hello? The voice on the other end was sleepy, groggy. It was my sister, Emily. Em, I need you to come over. Something's not right. She was quiet for a moment, then responded with a soft laugh. What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? Just come over. Please. I could hear my own voice shaking. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like someone's here. Watching me. Okay. I'll be there in a bit. I hung up and set the phone down. The silence that followed felt thick, oppressive, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. I turned back to the letter on the counter, my eyes scanning the words again, but they didn't provide any answers. I know what happened. I know what you did. You can't run from the past. My stomach churned. I thought I'd bury everything, but the past had a way of clawing its way back. I had to know who was behind this, who had sent the letter. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged. Suddenly, a thought flashed through my mind. What if the letter wasn't the only thing they'd left? What if there was something else? Something that I hadn't noticed yet? I hurried to the window and peered outside. The streetlights bathed the street in a pale glow, casting long shadows on the pavement. But there was no one. No sign of movement. Everything seemed normal. But how could it be? Then, something caught my eye. A small, folded piece of paper was lying on the ground just beneath the window, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I hadn't seen it when I'd looked out earlier. My pulse quickened as I rushed over to it. Kneeling down, I snatched the paper up, unfolding it carefully. Inside was a single sentence, written in the same neat, precise handwriting as the letter. You're not safe yet. My breath caught in my throat. The words were cold. Final. I stood up quickly, my head spinning. How had this person gotten in? Why couldn't I hear them? Had they been inside this entire time, hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to find the letter? I stumbled back into the living room, feeling the walls close in around me. The air was too still, too thick. Every sound seemed amplified. Every corner seemed to hide something just beyond my sight. Then, I heard it again. The same tapping sound, but this time it was closer. Too close. I spun around, eyes darting frantically. The hallway was empty, but the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was in my apartment, and they weren't going anywhere. I could feel my pulse racing as I backed towards the door, eyes flicking to every corner of the room. My breath came faster, louder. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I was frozen in place, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Was someone still there? Was it all in my head? The past, the letter, the footsteps, it was all closing in on me. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I couldn't breathe. The silence that followed the tapping felt even more suffocating than the footsteps themselves. I stood there, stock still, my ears straining, waiting for the sound to return. My pulse thudded in my ears. Every corner of the room felt like it was closing in on me. But there was nothing. The tapping, the sound of dragging feet, had stopped as abruptly as it had started. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was it real? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or had someone really been in my apartment? I glanced nervously at the door. It was locked. I had made sure of it when I first arrived home. The deadbolt was secure, the chain was in place. No one could have entered without me hearing. Or could they? Could someone have come in and out without making a sound? I felt my throat tighten as the thought settled in. I had no answers, only more questions. I glanced at the window again, the small piece of paper still clutched in my hand. The words on it had been so simple, so direct. You're not safe yet. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about the implications. Whoever had left this message wasn't just some prankster. They knew something. They knew about the letter. They knew about the past. My past. I moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtains just a little. The street outside was still, the same as before. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I felt it, the oppressive weight of something unseen, something lurking just beyond the frame of my vision. Then, I saw it. Just a shadow, flickering at the edge of the streetlight. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but my heart skipped a beat. Someone, or something, was out there. I turned quickly, my feet moving of their own accord. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what came next. I had to act. I had to do something. The tapping sound was gone, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I grabbed my phone and dialed Emily again, my fingers trembling as I punched in the numbers. This time, the phone rang longer than before. I waited for her voice to pick up, but it didn't. Come on, pick up, I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice oddly hollow in the stillness of the apartment. But there was no answer. I hung up and dialed again, more desperately this time. But still, nothing. My sister had never ignored my calls before. She had to know something was wrong. Why wasn't she answering? I pressed my back to the wall, my heart racing as I looked around the room. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no signs that anyone had been in here since I'd arrived. But the feeling of being watched, was almost unbearable. I turned to the door again, hesitant. Should I check the hallway? Should I leave? My legs felt like jelly, my body paralyzed with uncertainty. I could hear my breath coming faster, my mind racing through every possibility. Suddenly, there was a sound. A creak. Faint, but unmistakable. It came from the hallway. My pulse surged. The sound had come from the same direction as the tapping. My eyes locked on the hallway, now feeling like a dark tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. My instincts screamed at me to stay still, to keep quiet, to listen. The creak came again, then another, closer this time. The footsteps. I moved quickly, my hand reaching for the doorknob. But before I could touch it, there was a knock. A soft, almost polite knock on the door. I froze. Who could that be? I wasn't expecting anyone. No one else knew I was here. No one except Emily. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to face whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. But I knew I had to. With trembling hands, I unlocked the deadbolt. My heart thundered in my chest as I reached for the handle, slowly pulling the door open. What I saw on the other side made my breath catch in my throat. There, standing in the hallway, was Emily. But something was wrong. She looked different. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her clothes were wrinkled, as if she had been wearing them for days. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, staring at me. Emily? My voice cracked, a knot forming in my throat. What happened? Where have you been? She didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on me, her lips parted as though she were about to speak, but no words came. I stepped back, instinctively wanting to retreat, but I couldn't move. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A sound. Faint, but growing louder. The footsteps. The same tapping sound that had haunted me all night, now coming from the darkness behind Emily. I wanted to call out to her, to warn her, but I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat. And that's when I saw it. A figure. Just behind Emily. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its form was vague, like a shadow stretched too far, its outline shifting and flickering as though it wasn't quite solid. It was coming closer. I slammed the door shut. My heart was pounding, but blood rushing in my ears. I backed away, stumbling over the furniture. Was that really Emily? Or had something else, taken her place? My mind was a blur of confusion. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was the past truly coming back to claim me, or had I just slipped too far into madness? I could feel the walls closing in. There was no escape. The silence in the room was deafening after I shut the door. I pressed my back against it, every nerve in my body on high alert. My eyes were glued to the crack beneath the door, where shadows shifted like restless spirits. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, choked by the overwhelming sense of fear that gripped me. What had I just seen? Who had I just seen? I slowly turned toward the apartment. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with the lingering pressure of something unseen. My breathing was ragged, the fear settling in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I had to find answers. But the answers, if there were any, seemed just out of reach, slipping between my fingers as I grasped at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her face. Her stillness. The way she didn't respond. Where had she been? Why didn't she say anything? And that figure in the shadows behind her. I had seen it clearly. But it was more than just a shadow. It felt wrong. It felt alive, like it was watching me. Waiting. There was no way that was her. But why didn't she say anything? Why was she standing there like a mannequin? My mind reeled with questions, the answers slipping further and further from my grasp. I moved across the room, my eyes constantly darting to the window and the door. The small apartment now felt suffocating, like a trap closing around me. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. I kept checking my phone, but there was still no sign of Emily's response. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing. I opened the window slightly, desperate for a breath of air that didn't taste like fear. The outside world seemed so far away, yet everything inside me felt caged. The street outside was quiet, still. But even as I looked out, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing in on me from behind. I quickly turned, expecting to see something in the room with me, but there was nothing. Just the same empty walls. I closed the window and turned back to the apartment, a sense of dread crawling up my spine. Suddenly, there was a knock again. The knock wasn't on the door this time. It was coming from the window. It's impossible, I thought, but my legs carried me to the window anyway. My fingers trembled as I gripped the curtain and pulled it aside. Nothing. There was nothing outside. I almost laughed at myself, the tension bubbling up in my chest. The knocking had just been in my head, a trick of the mind, surely. I was so on edge, my thoughts spinning. That must be it. But then came the tap, soft, deliberate. The sound was like a faint whisper on the edge of my awareness. But it wasn't in my head. It was there. It was real. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I glanced toward the hallway, toward the direction where Emily had been. I couldn't stop myself from moving toward it. As I crept down the dark hallway, my every step seemed amplified in the stillness. I could feel the floor beneath me groaning with each step, echoing my fears. The hallway had never looked so long, so narrow. The shadows gathered in corners, shifting, stretching. There were no lights on, no sounds except the quiet creak of the old apartment settling. I reached the door where Emily had stood, but there was no sign of her. No shadow in the hallway. Only the dull hum of silence. I stood there, staring at the darkened hallway, my heart pounding. The fear was suffocating, almost paralyzing. Then the knocking came again. This time it was louder. Insistent. My legs moved before I could stop them, propelled by something more primal than reason. I rushed toward the living room, where I had left my phone, and grabbed it with shaky hands. I tried dialing Emily's number again. The phone rang, and then someone picked up. But it wasn't Emily. "Hello?" a voice rasped. It was rough, like it hadn't been used in years, hoarse and jagged. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. A cold chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound confident. but my voice shook. "I know you're here," the voice rasped again, barely more than a whisper. "You need to leave." My breath hitched. It was too late. The voice, it wasn't Emily's. Then came a sound from behind me. A scratch. It was slow, deliberate, as though something sharp was dragging across the wall. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see something. Nothing. But the scratching continued, louder now. Closer. I backed away from the phone, my eyes scanning the walls. The scratching grew louder, the air thick with dread. It was coming from within the walls. I ran to the nearest door, slamming it open and scanning the hallway. But there was no one there. Just the darkness. Just the silence. I was alone. The scratching continued, coming from the walls, as if something were trying to claw its way through. I couldn't stay here. The footsteps were back. But this time, they were much closer. And then I heard it, breathing. In the corner of the room, in the darkness beyond my view, something was watching me. And I couldn't escape. The sound of breathing, slow and steady, echoed in the room. It wasn't my own. It was deeper. The air itself seemed to thicken as if the very atmosphere was heavy with a presence that didn't belong. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to obey. I stepped back slowly, my feet dragging against the floor, not daring to take my eyes off the shadowed corner. The darkness there felt wrong. It was like the shadows were deeper than they should have been, reaching into places the light couldn't touch. "It's not real," I tried to tell myself, but the words had no weight. I had already passed the point where reason held any power. There was something here, something old and dangerous, and it had been waiting for me. I looked around the room, my gaze flitting between the window, the door, and the corners of the walls. Every inch of space seemed to pulse with a growing pressure, as though something unseen was slowly wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, the phone still gripped in my fingers. I hadn't even realized that I was still holding it. My mind was a blur of panic, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that corner. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. A figure stepped into view, emerging from the shadows like a ghost materializing out of nothing. I froze. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its outline barely distinguishable, but I could make out the silhouette of a person, tall, thin, with features that were too sharp to be human. The air in the room felt colder as it approached. It didn't walk. It glided, the way a shadow moves when it's not constrained by the laws of reality. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. The gaze was piercing, burning through me like ice. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted by the weight of fear. Then, the figure spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a whisper, a scraping sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped. "You should have left it alone." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were filled with something ancient, something that carried the weight of years of silence. I should have left it alone? What was it talking about? I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced, but the more I thought, the more I realized I had no answers. Only questions. The figure seemed to grow in size, its presence filling the room, overwhelming me. My vision blurred at the edges, my mind desperately trying to reject the reality of what I was seeing. "You know too much," the figure whispered. You will remember. The darkness thickened, swallowing everything. The air was so cold now that it hurt to breathe, the sensation sharp in my lungs. I turned, desperate to flee, but as I spun, I felt the sudden weight of something pressing down on me, holding me in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The wall. The scratching from within the walls. The breath behind me. It's not real. I repeated the words in my head, but they didn't make sense. I didn't know if I was going mad or if something was truly happening. I didn't want to find out. I couldn't. Then I heard the voice again, clear this time, as though it were right behind me. It's your fault, it hissed. You were supposed to forget. And in that moment, it all clicked. The letters. The ones in my mailbox. The ones written in Emily's handwriting. They weren't from her. They were from the thing in the shadows. The one who wanted to remind me of something I had forgotten, something I wasn't supposed to remember. My heart began to race. What had I forgotten? I spun around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure was closer now, so close I could feel its presence pressing against me. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, burned into me like twin flames. I couldn't look away. You remember the night, it said, the night you made the choice. The words hit me like a tidal wave. My mind flooded with fragmented memories. A flash of a different time. A different place. A promise I'd made. A decision I'd buried. No. No, it can't be. The figure stepped closer still, its mouth stretching into a grin that was all teeth, jagged and sharp. It felt like it was inside my head now, worming its way into my thoughts. You remember the day you left it behind, it whispered. Now, it's time to pay the price. The room around me began to spin. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching like hands, reaching for me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But no matter where I turned, the darkness followed. It was all around me, suffocating, drowning me in its weight. And just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shadows swirled and the figure vanished. For a brief moment, everything was still. But the fear, it didn't go away. The coldness remained, lingering like a shadow that would never leave. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The phone in my hand trembled violently. I had to leave. I had to get out. But my feet wouldn't move. The figure's voice lingered in my mind, its words echoing in the void. You remember now. You always will. And then, the silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. I had come face to face with the past I thought I had left behind. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.